Welcome back to the StingyTrigger tabletop. This is Trigger here again today to talk a little more gun philosophy with you. Today I'd like to talk about a term that is quite possibly the most misused, misunderstood, misrepresented, and maligned term in the firearms vocabulary lexicon. I am, of course, talking about Mexican carry. Now, for those of you who may be new to the firearms community, you may be asking yourself, Trigger, what's Mexican carry? Mexican carry, quite simply, is the practice of carrying of a firearm without the use of a holster or similar retention device. Most often, it refers to a firearm that has been tucked into a belt or waistband in order to carry it on or about one's person while being able to dispose of it quickly should the need arise. Now, a lot of folks, especially those who are unfamiliar with firearms, when you say things like Mexican carry, be it in practice or simply in discussion, evoke certain images, and they aren't necessarily the most positive. In fact, even myself, when I first heard the term Mexican carry, images popped into my head, well, like this, or like this, or like this. Okay, the last one wasn't actually any kind of gang member. That was actor Noel Guglielmi, who is in fact a very vocal anti-gang activist. Though he plays a gang member quite often in many of his cinematic roles, he's also a very outspoken member of his community, crusading to keep kids off of streets and out of gangs. I simply threw him in there because that's the kind of misconception that comes along with a term like Mexican carry. If you say that to someone, an image such as Noel pointing a gun at you kinda tends to pop into your head. However, that is not what Mexican carry refers to. And if you're going to Mexican carry, or if you're going to bring Mexican carry up in a discussion, you need to be prepared to understand the historical context and the importance of the concept, as well as its technical definition. A lot of people don't realize it, but Mexican carry is in fact a fairly old term. It was first popularized in the early 1800s during the Mexican independence movement, where they were attempting to gain independence from Spain. Spain, realizing what was happening, they saw the writing on the wall, enacted a number of very draconian laws that were an attempt to keep the Mexican people from gaining their independence. One of the big laws that they pushed was, of course, the confiscation and outlawing of firearms by civilians, trying to keep only the colonial militia and military and governmental officers armed in order to keep the population from uprising and breaking away. As a result, one of the specific regulations that they enacted made it a crime equivalent of being caught carrying a firearm to simply be in possession of or wearing a holster. The logic, of course, being, well, you're not going to be wearing a holster if you're not carrying a gun. Even though we didn't find a gun on you, clearly if you have a holster on your belt, you're just as guilty. And you and your family were most often subject to some pretty harsh reprisals if you were caught even with just a holster. As a direct result, great men such as revolutionaries Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla and Jose Maria Morelos popularized the concept of Mexican carry. They encouraged their fellow patriots and revolutionaries and freedom fighters to carry their firearms slung over their shoulder, tucked into a belt or a waistband, most often tucked into a sash worn around the waist, or carried in a waistcoat or vest. This allowed them to ditch their firearms quickly if they saw a federal patrol coming. So if they were, say, walking down the street and they saw a group of soldiers coming to them who were loyal to the government, they could take their pistol out of their sash, they could toss it in the dirt, kick some mud on top of it, chuck it in a horse trough, drop it in a ditch. Didn't matter. I don't have a holster on me. I don't have a pistol. I'm just a good citizen going out and about my business today. Of course I'm not armed, sir. They wouldn't be hassled. They could go then retrieve their gun later and continue their revolutionary efforts. Well, as we know, the Mexicans were in fact successful. They gained their independence from Spain in 1811, and many of the firearms freedoms were restored. This was, however, a short-lived victory. The French invaded and occupied Mexico in the middle of the 1800s. They only had about 30 or so years of several government systems coming and going as they were attempting to work out how they wanted to run their country. Unfortunately, before they could really get everything finalized and concrete, the French showed up and occupied them. In fact, by the late 1800s, the French had actually appointed a Habsburg Archduke, one Austrian Ferdinand Maximilian, to run Mexico for them. He was, of course, eventually captured by the revolutionaries when a number of high-ranking generals switched sides and declared their independence and helped the Mexican people gain their freedom from the French. That led to the repeated presidency of Porfirio Diaz, who, well, he was not a nice guy. He was pretty corrupt and pretty shady, and managed to stay in power basically as a dictator for about 15 years, give or take there. He wasn't finally ousted out of office until what is popularly known as the Mexican Revolution, which took place in 1911. It was at the urging of men such as José Doroteo Aranjo Arambula, better known as Francisco Villa or Pancho Villa up north here, and men like Emiliano Zapata and Venustiano Carranza, who, once again, bringing back the concept of Mexican carry to help keep their fellow fighters and revolutionaries safe, were finally able to wrest control and install a true constitutional government that exists to this day. So when you talk about the term Mexican carry up here, although in some places in the United States, particularly the Southwest, it doesn't exactly invoke the kindest images, if you use the term Mexican carry down in Mexico, the term has the weight on par with phrases like patriot or Minuteman up here in the United States. So I hope you understand that when the concept comes up, be it in practice or simply in discussion, that you understand the historical importance of Mexican carry. This simple concept kept a lot of freedom fighters free so that they could free their fellow countrymen from the oppression of the tyrants who were ruling them at the time. And it's an important part of both their and our heritage as firearms enthusiasts. So if you choose to Mexican carry, or even simply discuss the term in a public forum, you need to be aware not only of its technical definition, but also its historical importance. Mexican carry does not refer to a bunch of gangbangers tucking Glocks into their pants to avoid the popo. It refers to the necessary actions taken by patriots to ensure that themselves and their fellow countrymen remained free. As always, thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more fun gun and project videos. And remember, we're just a couple of city slickers working this out as we go along. Thanks for watching.